let's move on then on to item number 12.
Item number 12, subsurface desalination intake initial screening analysis and potable reuse feasibility study status report update.
Great. Ms. Taylor, it's yours. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I am Kathy Taylor, the Water System Manager, and I'm here to provide a status update of the desalination subsurface intake and potable reuse feasibility studies. So for my presentation, I will provide a background, and I also go over the work authorizations for this work effort. I'll talk about the subsurface intake initial screening analysis. I'll give you a workshop summary, and I'll provide you our next steps. So the background, we were at City Council on September 23rd, 2014, where Council directed us to explore options for converting the existing offshore intake that is sized for 10,000 acre-feet per year to a subsurface intake, and to evaluate opportunities for potable water reuse. And the Regional Water Quality Control Board, at our permit hearing with them on January 29th and 30th in 2015, included Council's directions in our NPDES permit amendment, plus they required us to submit an acceptable work plan by August 31st, 2015, and present findings to the board by June 30th, 2017, and that's after all of our work is done here. So for this work effort, staff, we partnered with the National Water Research Institute, or the NWRI. They are a nonprofit agency whose purpose is to focus on projects and programs that ensure safe, reliable sources of water. And the NWRI formed a TAP, or a Technical Advisory Panel, which is a panel of experts in the water field, and they were charged with providing independent technical review of the alternatives. This is a list of our TAP members. They are from the academia, the consulting world, and other water agencies. Their specialties are in water treatment, water reuse, desalinated water, hydrogeology, and the CEQA process. Under work authorization number 1, which was the work plan development, all of this work was completed in 2015. May 5th, we initiated the work plan development, which included screening criteria, developing the screening criteria for subsurface intakes and potable reuse. July 22nd, we released draft information for public comments. We held a public workshop on August 5th, where we received public comment and recommendations and comments from the TAP on the work plan. On August 31st, we submitted the final work plan for approval to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, which they approved, which the board approves on October 20th of 2015. Work authorization number 2 is the subsurface intake initial screening. With this, we're creating the basis of design, the conceptual design, and screening analysis. On September 22nd, 2015, we started the initial screening effort. January 13 of this year, we released the draft technical information in a public comment, and we held the second public workshop on January 27th, where we received public comments and recommendations and comments from the TAP. For the with the subsurface intake initial screening analysis, we looked at 6 different technologies, and we analyzed them as alternatives to our permitted, screened, open ocean to intake, which, as I said earlier, can produce 10,000 acre-feet per year of potable water. And the picture I put up here on the right is open ocean intake screening material. And just for scale, I put a 25-cent piece on there, and the openings of the intake are 1 millimeter thick. This is an overview of the existing desalination structure. I'll start down at the bottom of the picture with the yellow dots. That's where the intake structure would be. And the water would be conveyed through this pipeline, go on shore at our pump station and chemical area at 420 500 Street, and then it would be conveyed over to the desal plant, which is this green area, which is at 525 East John and Nolly Street. And on site at the desal plant, that's where we treat the water, and we'd separate the water from the brine, and the brine would be discharged through the orange line, which is actually a shared outfall with the El Estero wastewater treatment plant that ultimately is discharged 8,720 feet offshore. This is a schematic of the screened open ocean intake. We have an existing weir box on the beach, And between from the weir box extends for 2,500 feet a concrete pipe that is actually a carrier pipe for the HDPE or high density polyethylene intake. It's 36 inches in diameter, and that is connected to this manifold here, which is our open ocean intake. This is an exploded view. This is what it would look like. And the actual intake structures are the cylindrical structures on either sides of these boxes. And the cylindrical structures are approximately 4 foot in diameter and 12 feet long, and they're covered with the screening material that I showed on the previous slide. So the 6 alternative intake technologies that were considered, I will present these, but I'm not going to go into great detail about how they're constructed or how they operate. For people interested in that, I would direct them to the National Water Research Institute's website, and I'll show you that website at the end of my presentation. These alternatives were selected, but they were based on intake technology and recent studies conducted by others. So we looked at vertical wells, lateral beach wells, radial collector wells, slant wells, subsurface infiltration galleries, and horizontally directionally drilled wells. The work plan...
I'm going to have her go through the whole presentation and then ask for questions. So hold your questions, please.
Very good. The work plan screening criteria was geotechnical factors, hydrogeology factors, benthic topography, oceanographic factors, sensitive habitats, design and construction constraints. So this is how. So these are the 6 alternatives, and 4 of the alternatives cannot produce enough flow, and they impacted sensitive habitats. So as you can see, it's the vertical wells, the onshore infiltration gallery, radial collector wells, slant wells. They affected the sensitive habitat by dropping the water in the habitat anywhere between 1 and 4 feet, and also they cannot produce the 10,000 acre feet of flow that we require per year. The 2 that did not affect the sensitive habitats and could produce the flow were the subsurface infiltration galleries and the horizontally directionally drilled wells. So the initial screening criteria were categorized as not feasible, potentially feasible but did not meet the study objectives. And for those alternatives that were potentially feasible but didn't meet the study objectives, they can still be considered again in a future study. The initial screening results for all the criteria, none of the alternatives passed. One alternative, that was the horizontally directionally drilled wells, that was deemed not feasible because there is no successful experience with that technology. And 5 of the alternatives were deemed potentially feasible but did not meet the study objectives. As I showed on my previous slide, 4 of the alternatives did not produce the 10,000 acre feet per year, and they impacted sensitive habitats. And 4 of the alternatives, including the subsurface infiltration gallery, had design and construction constraints such as geology and available land. I want to talk a little more about the subsurface infiltration galleries, as I know there's a lot of interest about them. As I said, they were deemed potentially feasible but did not meet the study objectives. Per the approved work plan, any alternative must be within half mile of offshore, which defines the city's boundaries. And we looked at Leadbetter Beach, which was too shallow. The subsurface infiltration gallery on that beach would need to be 1.3 miles offshore and would cross a seismic fault. We also looked at East Beach, was too shallow. The subsurface infiltration gallery would need to be 1.6 miles offshore and again would cross a seismic fault. And West Beach, the construction would interfere with the harbor use, and the subsurface infiltration gallery would potentially cross a seismic fault. Public workshop number 2, we held on January 27th, 2016. The NWRI conducted this meeting, a public meeting, to get input on the subsurface intake alternatives and initial screening analysis. At that meeting, 11 public comments from 8 different parties were received and recorded, and the TAP provided comments and recommendations as well. As for the public comments, as I said, 11 were received, and responses to all comments have been made and will be included in the final document. None of the comments changed the conclusions of the feasibility study. And as for the TAP comments, staff has reviewed the TAP comments and are working to respond to each comment. Responses to all the comments will be included in the final document. And none of the comments from the TAP changed the conclusions of the feasibility study. Post-workshop 2 activities, what we're working on right now. Carollo Engineers, they are the consultant firm who is assisting us with this effort, along with city staff, are responding to the comments and recommendations received. Written responses to the public comments are available for review at the city clerk's office or at the NWRI website listed on the screen there. And that's also the website that people can go to if they're interested in learning more about the 6 different alternative technologies we investigated. And full written responses to the TAP comments will soon be available on the NWRI website. Right in the council report, it says that they have been made. That unfortunately, we were hoping at the time of this meeting we would have been able to post the responses, but we're still working on these. So we'll have that shortly. The next steps, workshop number 3. Potable reuse and initial screening analysis will be held on August 3rd, 2016, here in this room. We were hoping to have this meeting in June, but August 3rd was the earliest that the TAP could reconvene. And at that meeting, we'll present potable reuse concepts and results of the initial screening. We'll draft a feasibility report incorporating comments and recommendations from the public and the TAP. And then we will hold workshop number 4 if needed to consider any potable reuse alternatives that pass the initial screening. And we will provide council with a final presentation in spring of 2017 and a final presentation to the Regional Water Quality Control Board on May 2017 in advance of their June 2017 deadline they gave us for doing so. The future use of the subsurface infiltration feasibility study, intake feasibility study, I must say that this study has provided us with a lot of great information that we can use in the future, especially when we go to update our 2011 long-term water supply plan. We will be updating that post-drought, and it will include the new historic drought of record that we're currently experiencing. That will also rely on input from the revised safe yield of Lake Kachuma, which will include the new biological opinion for the lake. And we will better understand the role of desal for the city and as a regional use. And at that time, when we better understand desal and how we're going to use it and what our needs really are, we can revisit the subsurface intake alternatives to determine, if any of them are viable at that time. And we'll also be considering the role of potable reuse for the city and as a regional use as well. And under this, we'll further develop options identified in the feasibility study to help meet water supply needs. So with that, I will take questions.
Thank you. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. Can you go back to the last slide, please, Ms. Taylor? So you say revisit the subsurface intake alternatives based on the role of desal. What does that mean?
Go ahead and take that. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, at this point, we are following our long-term water supply. We have reactivated the desal for this drought, and at this point have not gotten any policy direction on what its role is going to be after this drought is over. And I think that the point is when this drought ends, we will certainly be looking for policy direction on will the desal plant continue to be just a drought supply? Will it have another role to play in our community now that we've made that investment? And that's what is meant by revisiting this and what its long-term role is.
Right, except that you've drawn conclusions about the feasibility of subsurface intake. How is that going to change just because time has passed? Or we're trying to figure out what we're going to do with maybe Montecito Water as a partner. I don't understand.
For example, Councilman Murillo, say we were to end this drought and we were to determine that really what the city needs in the long term is a 5,000 acre foot desal facility. That's what we need in the going now and into the future. That's all we're going to need from desal. We could go back to this report. We could pick up the alternatives that would produce 5,000 acre feet, and then we can go on and study those related to that specific supply need.
Right, but what I understand is you didn't study 5,000 acre feet. You used 10,000 acre feet as the standard. I mean, I looked through it. I saw that there were some that passed the test of a lower yield. So, I mean, this is really important information for us to consider. So we're raising water rates on people. We're using enormous amounts of energy to run this plant. And now the conclusion here is that unless we do something different, we will be destroying marine life as we suck the water in to the plant. So if we can get some water yield at a lower rate, at a lower yield, and not destroy marine life or make a balance of it, then that's the discussion that we should be having, right?
Councilmember Rio, we have provided, and it goes into great detail in the report, what those right there are the ranges of what we believe each one of those alternatives could produce. So the report, consistent with what our work plan says, is to identify if it can't reach 10,000, what can it produce? And so we believe that that is the jumping off point for when we do go specifically to understand what the role of desal is in the long term. We go back to this list and we say, here's what our need is from desal. These are the sources that will produce that volume of water. And then we go forth and we study those options in much greater detail.
Well, you're giving me a little bit of hope with this, but I don't appreciate that we're rushing through this because it's such a big topic. I'm uncomfortable with that, and that you didn't talk about the 6 methods. Are there other methods besides those 6? Let me start there with my question.
We, for the sake of the time for this, we spent probably 25 minutes on each one of those alternatives during the workshop, and that's available. And I do apologize that we skipped through, but I think just for the sake of time of this council that information is available. And I think if you're interested, it's really enlightening to see. We went through and picked technologies that had shown and been used and had been implemented somewhere in the world. And we put it to our TAP panel. Is there something we missed? Is there a technology that we should have included? And actually, their feedback was that you picked, these are all the ones that we should have been focused on. And then one of their biggest critiques is that we were optimistic in how much each one of those sources could actually produce. That was based on their experience with some of these different techniques. But
so the panel decided to look at these 6.
No, we did, and we left it to the panel to tell us if there was any other alternatives we missed. If there was, we would have included those as well. And they didn't have any additions to this list.
And then to get us to this place, we asked you to look at using the existing offshore intake, right? So the study did not look at any other way. Is that right?
We looked at replacing the existing intake facility with subsurface. That was what we were directed to do.
Okay. Now that we're at this conclusion, it seems limiting. But just one more question, Madam Mayor, and I know we're under time crunch. So it's possible to do a combination of open ocean and subsurface, or no? It's one or the other.
Oh, absolutely. I don't see this at all as a conclusion of anything. I think this is the first step, and to an ongoing discussion about what our supply needs are. And so I see this as one piece of information that's going to help feed into development of our long-term water supply plan when we get to that. But I don't see this as the end. And that's where just as you mentioned, the combination, all that stuff will be on the table going forward. This is just one component.
That's it for now, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Actually, could you put back any other questions from colleagues first? Go ahead, Mr. Dominguez.
Why didn't we study some alternatives with a smaller acre footage?
The direction from the council was to study a replacement of the existing 10,000 acre foot facility. We have identified in all the alternatives what they are capable of, what volume we believe, a range that we could get from those. And so it is, in my mind, ready to go back and study when we understand what our needs are from desal. I mean, if our plan is to shut desal down after this drought and not use it, then we could save significant money not studying or installing another subsurface intake facility. The one thing that we have stopped short of doing is the economic, environmental, and social impacts of these. That's sort of this, if something passed this initial screening, that was the next step, was to study those elements. And so that is what we have held off from studying. That cost of that is roughly $1.1 million would be the next price tag to go forward and study those alternatives if they had been found feasible. And since these haven't been found feasible at this time because they didn't meet the criteria, it doesn't mean that we don't ever revisit it again. It just means until we have more information, it isn't worth studying this situation anymore. And this is exactly what's in the work plan. This is why we define the work plan, is so that we had a clear roadmap going forward.
So let me just try to put this in a little context, and then we'll go to public comment. In that, we're not making a decision today, so this is an update. There's still the final report you still need to bring out. You wanted to have up to today, and didn't get to happen today, but that's fine. And had we had to make a decision on which option to look for, of course we want to go study those in more detail at a public hearing like this one. But I would recommend that it is fascinating, each of the six, looking how they would work or not work. Can you put the slide back up of the 6 alternatives and the amount of acre footage they could handle? Okay, so I'm understanding then, if I'm looking at this, that it's just the last 2 there was able to have the capacity of 10,000 acre feet. The others had less than that, and so if and when when we have the policy conversation after this drought of what is the role of desal in non-drought years or in a regional capacity, then we have to decide, well, what capacity do we want to produce on an annual basis? And that would determine, if it's less than 10,000 acre feet, if there are any one of those other items in the red that we'd want to pursue in terms of a potential subsurface intake. Is that correct? Okay. And then, so the other question I had about the feasibility and the location of where these items would happen. So some of them you're talking about Ledbetter Beach or West Beach. So the piping would have to, we're not moving the desalination plant location, right? So, okay, so the cost associated or the impact of creating piping to West Beach or Ledbetter Beach is a very long way to get to the actual facility on Yananali Street. Right, we're making that right. I'm just making sure we're understanding. We're not moving the desalination plant just based on looking at where the intake valve is going to be.
That is correct. All of this would be piping, and again, that's just a technical issue. The assumption is that with any of these options, all that piping could feasibly be put in.
So when you said it was 1.5 miles away instead of within the half a mile within city boundaries, that's 1.5 miles from the shoreline at Ledbetter Beach. That's not including the additional length it would take to get from, let's say, Ledbetter Beach to the desal plant. Is that right?
That's correct. Some of the subsurface intake galleries would need to be with upwards of a mile offshore into the water that's roughly 70 feet in depth, so you get a more stable ocean bed, and that's really critical to the success of these. And so what we've seen with these is having to build platforms to get out to that a mile offshore to be able to maintain and operate those facilities. Again, those are things that would be tackled during an economic and environmental analysis that would be the next phase had they survived this initial phase.
So, and then my final question is, there's the intake procedure, which is obviously subsurface, hence subsurface intake, and then the entire piping is also subsurface, or does it go up does the piping somehow go above the seafloor in the water, like the current intake valve does, or is the whole thing subsurface until you get to the desalinated plant, like near the, is the whole thing underground? Or we don't know?
We don't know.
Okay.
It likely would be directionally drilled under the seafloor, but we really haven't answered that question. I just want to point out that the horizontal directional drilling, I think, has the most likelihood of success for our facility. It's a really interesting product. The problem is they've been challenged to have it successfully work in the few installations where it's been done, but long term, if they ever perfect that product, it really is quite extraordinary. It's basically like the oil platforms. It's able to drill out and put in these lines without having all of this stuff on the ocean, without digging up the ocean floor. It really is an impressive technology. Unfortunately, it just hasn't matured yet, and we're hoping other people will spend some money on it to mature that industry.
Okay. All right, thank you. So let's go, and thank you for your patience. We're going to start with James. James is there. You are, James, and Corey. You're waiving your 2 minutes. So James, you have up to 4 minutes. Thank you very much. And then followed by Kira Redmond. Go ahead.
Mayor Schneider and council members, James Hawkins with Heal the Ocean. We continue to participate in the development of a feasibility study for potable reuse and subsurface intake alternatives, including providing comment at the January 27th, 2016 National Water Research Institute workshop. You will recall that at your September 22nd, 2015 council meeting, we raised concerns that the 10,000 acre-feet per year benchmark could prevent a comprehensive and timely analysis of potable reuse. While the ultimate structure of this feasibility study is not what we had originally envisioned, it is still progress. As it stands today, no project alternative in this study will be designated as infeasible simply because it cannot produce 10,000 acre-feet per year of water. This study is moving the ball forward because the city is undertaking the critical work to determine the maximum amount of water that could be produced by both potable reuse and subsurface intake options. While the original draft of this study would have ruled out many potentially viable project alternatives, the current study is setting the stage for future work. While Heal the Ocean is not actively involved in the issue of subsurface intakes, we were initially concerned with how the screening criteria were being applied to the various subsurface intake alternatives. We brought up these issues in our written comments to the National Water Research Institute, and we were glad to see that Carollo engineers and the technical advisory panel shared our perspective that a not feasible designation was inappropriate for the number 3, number 8, and number 9 screening criteria, which I believe you can see in the table in your agenda packet. We greatly appreciate their attention to this issue. In moving beyond this feasibility study towards the future of water supply planning in the city, the important question from Heal the Ocean's perspective is not if potable reuse will be further assessed, but when. City staff contends that this additional work will be done as a part of the process of updating the city's long-term water supply plan. However, we question how soon such a process will realistically commence. In waiting to further investigate potable reuse, we only risk entrenching ocean desalination as the primary supply of water for the city. While we appreciate staff's efforts to avoid the need for a larger desalination plant, the possibility of a future expansion project underscores why Heal the Ocean is so concerned with the timing of this issue. At the council hearing on subsurface intake and potable reuse feasibility study in September 2015, Mayor Schneider made the excellent point that Heal the Ocean's preferred timeline and staff's timeline are the same until this summer, when the potable reuse work by Carollo engineers is likely to be completed. Assuming this work demonstrates that potable reuse is at least potentially feasible, which we believe is likely, it is our position that the city should immediately move forward with further developing this supply. The continuing drought emergency in our region shows that we do not have the luxury to wait. In the coming months, Heal the Ocean respectfully asks that council and staff seriously consider our position and assess whether it makes sense to wait on moving forward with a supply of water that holds such great promise. Thank you.
Thank you. Kira Redmond, and then Laura, you're waiving your 2 minutes. Okay, great. You also have up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. As you can probably imagine, Channel Keeper is extremely disappointed with the direction this study has taken. Contrary to Mr. Hagmark's statement earlier, at the September 2014 council meeting where you made the direction to staff to do this study, you didn't say, look at replacing 10,000 acre feet. You said, look at options. When we pressed you to undertake the study at that time, what we hoped would result was an honest and realistic assessment that could inform us all whether a subsurface intake could feasibly be built in order to avoid killing trillions of marine organisms every day with your desalination plant at the actual capacity it is being recommissioned. If that was also the city's goal with the study, then sadly, you've failed. If your goal in conducting this study was to appease the environmentalists and to deflect the political heat you were getting for resisting even examining the environmentally superior alternative, well, you failed then too. If your goal was to fabricate evidence to support a desired predetermined outcome to show that subsurface intakes are infeasible, well, then you've succeeded. This study is disingenuous and it's flawed because it was deliberately designed to all but ensure that outcome. Despite the fact that the desal plant is currently being recommissioned to produce 3125 acre-feet per year of water, the study defined feasible as capable of producing 10,000 acre-feet, more than 3 times that amount. Had the study defined feasible as capable of producing 3125 acre-feet per year, then it would have most likely shown that 5 of the 6 subsurface intakes examined would be feasible. In fact, the table in the study depicting the maximum capacity that each subsurface intake would be capable of producing indicates that. But such a conclusion would put the city in the sticky position of having to justify why, if it is feasible, you might choose not to pursue that alternative in order to make desal less environmentally harmful. And that's clearly the subtext here. The use of 10,000 acre-feet per year threshold is inappropriate because, for one, it flies in the face of the recently adopted statewide desal policy, which requires subsurface intakes unless they are proven to be infeasible, and says a design capacity above the demonstrated need shall not be used by itself to declare subsurface intakes infeasible. It also does a great disservice to you and to Santa Barbara ratepayers, who deserved an honest assessment of whether less environmentally harmful alternatives were feasible in reality, not in some hypothetical and unlikely future scenario. I voiced concern about this at the first meeting of the Technical Advisory Panel in August of last year, and the concern was echoed by the Regional Water Board in a letter to you dated October 20th, 2015. In that letter, the Regional Board did approve the scope of the study with the following proviso. The studies must evaluate the technical feasibility of the maximum capacity of potable reuse and subsurface intake options in order to provide information on whether the alternatives could independently or combined potentially replace the screened open ocean intake. However, the study expressly does not do that. The reasons Ms. Taylor gave for why 4 of the 6 options were infeasible, not enough beachfront, too far offshore, those are to produce 10,000 acre-feet. It wasn't examined what would be feasible or not at 3125. Your staff have said they might do that at some point in the future when you revise your long-term water supply plan, but there's no guarantee and there's no excuse to kick the can and not do it now. So I'm here to ask you to fix this mistake and do the right thing. Direct that the study be revised to give a more fair and useful feasibility analysis of the various subsurface intake options at realistic capacity levels, 3125 acre-feet, 7,500, 5,000, and the amount of water that would be produced if the plant is again placed in standby mode, as well as in combination with an open ocean intake or potable reuse. I also ask that you direct staff to make sure the potable reuse feasibility study examines these various capacities as well. If you decide not to do so, Channel Keeper will be lobbying the Regional Water Board to require it of you. Thank you very much.
Okay, that concludes public comment. It's back to council. Just a simple question. Well, I don't know if it's simple. A question. The potable reuse, in terms of state legislation and allowing for it, right? Currently, state law does not allow for direct potable reuse, but it's indirect. And so how does that relate to the studies as what we're looking at into August and beyond?
So we are looking into both indirect and direct potable reuse. And, of course, the regulations, we're hoping for some guidelines by the end of this year for potable reuse. But it's still, optimistically, potable reuse is still 10 years out from, being something that I think there will be some regulations and stuff supporting it. Certainly pilot projects is always something we can look at, but we're going to be bringing all that information to get forward this summer, touching base again with the council. Maybe there's additional work we want to do on it, but that's the current strategy. We're looking at both of those options, potable and indirect and direct potable reuse.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Madam Mayor, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mr. Hagmark, looking at this slide, this says that subsurface intake is feasible, but at the numbers in the red.
It is, and just to be clear, too, it wasn't the only criteria, as mentioned, it wasn't the only criteria that ruled those options out. They also were ruled out because they had impacts to sensitive habitat. So basically, the Mission Lagoon would be impacted by those operation of those subsurface intake facilities. And so that's why we have some pretty good information now, understanding what's available and what the impacts of those facilities are too.
I just to respond to some of the public comment, that we are going to have the conversation about what is the role of desal after this drought is over. And Montecito Water District is still part of that conversation. We have a path about dealing with, we talked about quite at length today about the drought situation and what's happening with the current desal and its construction. When that happens, obviously, these studies need to be brought back and figured out is what are all the options that we have available to us, whether it's at 3125 or 7,500 or 1,000 or 10,000, and what are the cost estimates and what's the impact on the environment on each of those objects. So I don't see this as an end of the process here. In fact, I mean this is information that I think will be very timely to have when we're ready to have that conversation. We're not having that conversation yet because we're not out of this drought yet, and we may say the desal plant should only be used for drought situations, which would still bring this conversation back to use into the future, because at the next drought, do we want to be right where we are today with an open ocean intake or not? I think that's a good policy discussion to have. Mm-hmm. So I just want to, at least for my end, emphasize that we need further conversation and study on a policy level of what these options are, and we're gathering that information, which is going to be very helpful. So that's just what I'm getting out of today's presentation, and I'll look forward to seeing the final report when it's ready. Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. What a daunting and some would call it interesting and difficult hour and a half of testimony we've had today. And thank you, Mr. Hagmark, for both the presentation and all the work that you and your staff have done to deliver all of this difficult news today. Not much is going right, and you are on the hot seat. And I appreciate your work and your tenacity in keeping all of this together. It's very, very difficult. We're very lucky to have you doing it. If we have another bad year, the 10,000 acre feet, unfortunately, we could be building a desal plant for 10,000 acre feet. Not that long from now. Here it is. So, and also at the costs that everywhere we're looking, we're spending the next $3 million, $5 million, $10 million. So all of these forces are hitting us simultaneously. And it's a painful, difficult situation that we find ourselves in. But for this particular element, there is nothing on these alternatives that says 10,000 acre feet. We see the 63 on the onshore infiltration gallery. We could be building a 10,000 acre foot system year after next. If we come up snake eyes much more. So I think we're doing the right thing now, and I don't think we're taking anything off the table for the long term. And that good work is being done to tee up this infiltration issue for a sustainable, long-term use of the desal plant. So while I certainly appreciate the comments that are being made, I don't appreciate the innuendo about how this being disingenuous, such like. This is not disingenuous. This is hard work, difficult work being done now in the midst of a crisis. And I think we're doing the right thing here, and I think we're doing good work.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Yeah, Mr. White is absolutely right. This is a conservative in the sense of saving approach, and it's unfair to trying to cast a negative light on it. I'd have to say I'm impressed with your knowledge and appreciate what you've done. Keep going. We're behind you.
Mr. Hart?
Yeah, I just want to echo the complexity of this and the shades of gray, and appreciate Channel Keeper being engaged in this and really pushing us to get the right information to inform these decisions as we go forward. I mean, clearly there's an issue here. There's a real difficult reality check of what's feasible versus what's theoretically possible. And I think we're pushing the envelope on that regard. I'm not convinced that there's good, solid evidence of systems that are operational now that make sense, but we're examining that really carefully. And I know you want us to do more of that, and I appreciate your interest in that, but we're trying to find a sweet spot between, the urgent need to get this facility going, meet the requirements of the permitting agencies, and keep options open to use this in a huge range of different ways. And I think, from my perspective, we're trying to do that, honestly. We're not doing that in the way that you described as us just trying to check off a box and move on. The issue of the potable reuse, I want us to go that direction. The state isn't ready yet for us to do that. So we're pushing the envelope in that regard, too. I think Mr. Hagmark, talking about a 10-year time frame, that's longer than I'd like to see. I'd like us to be doing an experimental project. But we do have to have help from the state to give us the path to make that work. So I want to recognize the tremendous work the staff has done, too, and really very difficult situation, and I don't even think it's going to get easier. The things we heard today with the drought update is that we're potentially hitting the perfect storm of things not going right that Councilmember White talked about, and it's concerning. And so we're doing the best we can, and we're moving it forward as fast as we can, and trying to meet all these long-term and short-term objectives at the same time, and that's not easy to pull off. So I think we should be recognized for trying hard. Maybe not meeting every criteria at the highest standard that we'd like to have in a calmer, more deliberative, long-term water supply context, not in a crisis, but that's not the situation we're in right now.
Okay, there are no more lights on, so thank you. There's no motion needed for this, so I appreciate the information, and to be continued.